Hi, and welcome back to the Contemporary Old West with B.F. Biles. If you enjoy Westerns, I hope you'll hit the subscribe and notification icons. I truly appreciate your support. If you're enjoying the story and you're interested in a signed copy of my novel, Hunting Charm, I'd ask you to check out my Amazon page, or you can email me directly. Again, any support is deeply appreciated. In today's episode, you'll hear part 2 of chapter 8 of my novel, Hunting Charm. If you haven't listened to the previous chapters, I recommend you do so. I have the first 7 chapters and part 1 of chapter 8 in a playlist. It's probably best you start with chapter 1. In today's plate of history beans, I'll continue my look at Indian territory in the 19th century. This time I'll focus on some of the Black Townships and settlements that sprang up in central Oklahoma following the dissolution of slavery after the Civil War. So without further ado, here's part 2 of chapter 8 of Hunting Charm, The Slap. Hunting Charm, chapter 8, part 2, The Slap. Cynthia Johnson looked suspiciously at the white woman. She knew better than to question her husband. Nevertheless, unlike Cecil, who had been freed from slavery as a young boy, Cynthia had no illusions about the decency of white folks. She knew they usually seemed kind, but their kindness often came hand in hand with unspeakable cruelty. Her previous masters, a Louisiana family named Tanner, had seemed civilized and humane. Mrs. Tanner, the wife of the plantation owner, had a school for the black children where she taught reading and some math. As a teacher, Mrs. Tanner, outwardly benign and sweet, was nevertheless exacting in her demands. Any slave child who didn't sit silently and listen might suffer a slap on the hand with a ruler, or in some cases much worse. On one occasion, Cynthia, up through the night serving drinks and snacks to a group of men playing faro in the main parlor, fell asleep during one of Mrs. Tanner's lessons. Cynthia's mistress had seemed calm enough as she led her outside. She quietly scolded Cynthia for sleeping, then sent one of the boys to the butchering shed to fetch her son Eli for further chastisements. Cynthia had already heard stories of Eli, and when he arrived, grinning, shoving her toward the ginning barn, she felt a sickness in her gut. The machinery inside the ginning facility had always seemed foreign and complicated to Cynthia. Eli, who always carried a cane, examined her as he closed the door behind them. "Y'all is sure a purty thing. Y'all know it's not proper to sleep during class time. Mama takes the time to teach you letters and such, and this is the thanks she gets. You think this is good behavior?" "No, sir." "No, it ain't. Go on and get them bloomers down." Eli forced her to strip. After beating her until blood dripped from her back, he assaulted her sexually, pressing her face onto a table as he grunted with pleasure. When he finished, Eli ordered her to dress and stop crying. He escorted her back to class where Mrs. Tanner, still speaking in her kindly tone, said the punishment for sleeping in class a second time would be even worse. Cynthia couldn't imagine anything worse than the caning and rape she had just endured. While she never slept in class again, attentiveness and silence didn't guarantee protection from Mrs. Tanner's polite wrath. The following winter, when classes resumed following the cotton harvest, one afternoon the plantation mistress found the back door of the schoolroom had been left ajar. Mrs. Tanner had warned students they must keep doors and windows closed because failure to do so could result in the room growing cold. The wood stove, she explained, had to be used sparingly because burning too much wood could damage the stove and set an example of wastefulness. Mrs. Tanner claims Cynthia left the door ajar because earlier that morning she had been sent to the well for a pail of drinking water. Cynthia started to point out that other students had been going in and out to the privy, but realized doing so might bring her owner's wrath down on one of her classmates. Mrs. Tanner once again escorted her outside and sent another student to the house, where Eli spent his afternoons napping and drinking brandy. Eli grinned widely when he saw Cynthia that day. His look sent such a wave of dread through her, the hairs rose on the back of her neck. They made their way silently to the cotton gin, Cynthia shuddering in fear. "Get them clothes off, gal." Eli's voice sounded husky, and he licked his lips in a devilish way. For a moment, Cynthia started to comply, started to simply strip and allow Eli to do his work. Then a deep anger arose within her. "No, sir, I ain't gonna take off my clothes." "No, sir," Eli mocked, repeating the words again and again. "No, sir. No, sir. Gal, you ain't got the right to ever tell me no, sir." He swung the cane, striking her on the side of the head, sending her reeling along the edge of a table. Then, with the self-righteousness born of generational wealth and privilege, Eli ripped the clothing from Cynthia's body, beat her to the brink of unconsciousness, then brutally raped her, leaving her bleeding and comatose on the floor. She woke some time later in her own bed, her auntie by her side, holding a cold compress to her temple. Her entire body felt broken. She spent the next week recovering from Eli's beating. Old Mr. Sticks, an elderly slave who did doctoring around the plantation, said she had bruising of the brain. The haze lifted eventually, and she was expected to return to work. On cold days like the one in February, when Eli raped and nearly beat her to death, her right shoulder and neck still reminded her of that day. At those times, she prayed for hell's existence, though she feared the Bible stories about the place were imaginary. Cynthia understood something many Christians never do. The idea of hell isn't to scare people into behaving properly. No, the ancient Israelites who wrote about a place of weeping and gnashing of teeth did so for another reason altogether. The biblical notion of hell is there to offer a shred of comfort to those who have suffered at the hands of the self-righteous. Hell, the notion it might exist, gives the downtrodden the feeling that some equity may exist in the next life, because it sure as hell doesn't exist in this one. Following her recovery, Cynthia continued working in the Tanner kitchen, but something inside her had changed. She could no longer enter the dining area without shaking uncontrollably for fear she might see Eli. Unfortunately, avoiding him, especially at meal times, was impossible. The cook quickly saw the problem and allowed Cynthia some leeway. One afternoon, however, Eli entered the kitchen looking for a snack. When Cynthia saw him, she felt such panic she ran out the back door and burrowed into a small recess beneath the milking shed. She remained there for nearly 16 hours, hidden. She heard the others calling for her, but she felt paralyzed there where the ground smelled of sour milk and the crickets chirped for a mate. She didn't come out until old Mr. Sticks found her the next morning and in his kind voice told her dozens of times that things would be okay. A week or so later, the elder Mr. Tanner, perhaps the only one of the Tanner clan with even the slightest insight into human psychology, realized that Cynthia had become useless for work around his place and ordered her into a wagon with 2 other slaves. They drove to Baton Rouge, where, in exchange for 2 saddle ponies, Cynthia became the property of Jake McQueen. At first, living with the Muskogee proved more difficult than life had been on the Tanner plantation. The hierarchy of the tribe confused her, and because she occupied the lowest rung in the Creek social order, Cynthia was often forced to labor from morning to night at jobs requiring strenuous exertion, carrying water, scraping hides, gathering firewood, slaughtering and processing pigs, buffalo, and horses. When food was short, she suffered from hunger, but at those times she could see that everyone suffered equally, and thankfully, shortages were rare. Despite the hard work and occasional hunger, the men of the tribe never assaulted her sexually, and after a time, the Creek people, particularly Jake McQueen's clan, began to treat her like family. One afternoon, her second year there, some of the men constructed a small clay oven inside her adobe hut, which made the place much more comfortable during the sometimes freezing winter months. The next summer, one of Jake's wives gave her a pair of hand-stitched moccasins, and as her skill as a gardener improved, the women began speaking with her in their language, which she gradually learned. After 3 years with the Muskogee, despite the hard work, she began to feel at home and, at times, even happy in her new life. Cynthia could never forget Mrs. Tanner, the white woman's polite wrath, her willingness to ignore her son's brutal behavior. Looking at Doreen Tarwater, Cynthia saw the same look she had seen so often in Mrs. Tanner's eyes, a dismissive gaze, one you might give a cow or mule. "Get your things and I'll show you the barn," Cynthia said, striding away. Doreen followed numbly. "Is there any place I can wash up before supper?" she asked. "There's water in the horse tank for them that has to have it," Cynthia replied. "Or there's a creek about a half-mile in that direction." She pointed to the south. "The creek is cleaner for bathing than the horse tank. Otherwise, we heat water on Saturdays and the whole family has proper baths." "Will you bring my meals to the barn, or will I—" Doreen stopped for a moment, Cynthia's tone sinking in. It occurred to her that her well-being depended upon Cynthia Johnson, a woman who had no reason to care for her at all. For most people, such a realization would have given them pause, but Doreen didn't like the tone. "You ain't got to worry about your meals," Cynthia said. "We ain't the kind of folks gonna refuse anyone a meal when we got plenty. I can send one of the children with your plate, but we ain't your servant folks." The final remark, the second time the colored woman had spoken to her in a condescending tone, was all Doreen could stomach. She spun to address her hostess. "You are not to speak to me in that way, missy. I do not know who you believe you are, but I can assure you I will not be spoken to like that by a colored." Cynthia pulled back, reacting to Doreen's sudden tirade, lowering her head, cringing slightly, a response conditioned by years of servitude. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Cynthia heard herself say. "You better be sorry," Doreen responded, her tone sharp and commanding. "I will not be spoken to in such a disrespectful way, especially by the like of you." Cynthia, already cursing herself for her cowed response, raised her head, pulling herself up, glaring now at Doreen. "Now I simply ask if I will be taking my meals in the barn," Doreen continued. "It's a simple question. Perhaps it's too difficult for your simpleton's mind to understand." Cynthia felt her own anger rise. Then, almost unconsciously, she raised her right hand, and with muscles hardened by years of labor, she swung, striking Doreen with an open-handed slap, knocking her to the ground. Now I'll tell you something, Mrs. Spoiled Pants. You are the one who won't be speaking to me in such a way. I ain't your slave gal, and I won't be treated like one. You may think it's appropriate to ride into someone's home and start ordering them about like some queen of the ball, but that ain't my idea of good behavior. Now I told you I will send one of the children with your meals. I will also ring the dinner bell so you will know to expect him. Cynthia shook in anger, staring into Doreen's face, daring her to respond. Doreen, her head spinning from the forcefulness of Cynthia's blow, suddenly felt something new: fear. The anger left her, and she began to cry as she realized that Cynthia, a powerful woman, had the physical prowess to enforce her sharp words. Cynthia paused, regretting the slap, and spoke again, her tone softening. Now, I don't know why you're here, and just as quick as I can. I plan to discuss this with my Cecil. I ain't the type to be inhospitable, but you ain't my master. You understand? You ain't my master. Doreen nodded, sniffing. The shed is right over there. I'll let you find your way from here. Cynthia looked once again at Doreen, who was sobbing uncontrollably. If the white woman had been feeling anger toward her family before, the slap would surely make matters 10 times worse. Cynthia felt a chill up her spine, then stumbled backwards. It had all happened so quickly. She looked around desperately, but the children and Cecil were nowhere to be seen. Adrenaline surged, fight or flight, and an almost inaudible gasp of fear escaped Cynthia's lips. She turned and half ran, half walked back to the house. In today's plate of history beans, I'll take a brief look at Black Townships that formed in Indian Territory between 1865 and 1920. Following the Civil War, a unique chapter in Black American history took place in Oklahoma. For a period of around 50 years, from the time of emancipation in 1863 until around 1920, over 50 all-black townships formed, many of them in the area depicted in my book, Hunting Charm. In the early years of Black Townships, many of them formed because the U.S. government required native tribesmen like the Muskogee and Jake McQueen in Hunting Charm to designate specific lots of land on an individual basis. In many cases, the African American folks formerly owned by the Muskogee, Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes remained in Oklahoma following emancipation. It is estimated that the 5 civilized tribes owned around 4,000 slaves in 1860. Following the freeing of slaves, many of the new freedmen, as they were often called at the time, claimed land of their own in what was then called Indian Territory. More freedmen, hearing about what was happening with Black Townships, traveled to Oklahoma and joined these new communities, or formed communities of their own. In addition, during the Oklahoma Land Rush of 1889, more blacks joined, an estimated 40,000 in all. Around the turn of the 20th century, pressure from white settlements and, in some places, local statutes were created to limit the growth and prosperity of black townships. Some towns failed because of these racially biased laws, but most survived until the Great Depression and consequent Dust Bowl era further decimated tax bases. Today, of the 50 or so towns that once existed, only a few remain, including the town of Boley, a town situated in roughly the same place I've imagined Cecil Johnson and Jake McQueen lived. In 1908, Booker T. Washington, famous African-American educator, author, and lecturer, and the founder of Tuskegee University, wrote an article for Outlook magazine titled An African American Community in Oklahoma. The article is specifically about Boley, Oklahoma. Mr. Washington described Boley as, quote, the youngest the most enterprising, and in many ways the most interesting of the Negro towns in the United States. A rude, bustling western town, it is a characteristic product of the Negro immigration from the South and Middle West into the new lands of what is now the state of Oklahoma. Washington goes on to say that the migration of African American people into the eastern half of Oklahoma, quote, has brought into these new lands not a helpless and ignorant horde of black people, but land seekers and home builders, men who have come prepared to build up the country. For a time, African American people did just that in Indian Territory. They built communities with black-owned banks, schools, and churches. In short, these folks built communities of their own. Unfortunately, few of the many black townships remain today. As I already said, there were a confluence of factors that led to their decline, perhaps the most challenging being the influx of white settlers and the effects of the Great Depression. Still, a few towns remain. Places like Boley, Langston, Redbird, Tallahassee, Taft, Lima, Brooksville, and a few others. Driving through Boley, I must admit the place seemed like many small towns in Texas and elsewhere. The houses and public places aren't in great shape. Few folks live there anymore. That's true of other black towns I visited, but the town of Langston, Oklahoma still remains as a thriving reminder of the original dream of the estimated 40,000 African Americans who settled these places between 1865 and 1920. If you're interested in a more in-depth look at African American communities in Indian Territory, I'll post a few links in the comments below. That's it for today's chapter from Hunting Charm and my plate of history beans covering black townships in Indian Territory in the late 19th and early 20th century. If you enjoyed today's episode, I hope you'll take a second to like and subscribe. Hope to see you again next week on the Contemporary Old West channel with BF Biles.